Okay.
Okay, well, this is a real delight to be able to have this presentation with two of the people who are really experts in the subject of international trade, international business. I had the opportunity to actually be a student of both of them. Nien Su was in charge of staffing, our staff director for the Committee on Asia and the Pacific, which I chaired. And Nien, you and I worked together for what, about 5 years? Is that it?
Yeah, Phil says 6 years, so I go with what Phil says.
Phil doesn't forget anything. For 6 years, and prior to your coming to work in my congressional office, you did a stint at the State Department. Is that correct?
That's correct. State Department, White House, and also doing business in China as well.
Okay, tell us what you did at the as staff director for the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific.
Well, sure. It was an amazing time. Essentially, provide oversight on the Department of State and their functions on U.S. diplomacy with regard to Asia. We implemented your business focus, your manufacturing agenda, and making sure that manufacturing comes back to the United States and to help American companies doing business overseas. We held a number of hearings, including on e-waste and a number of issues, 6-party talks, North Korea, everything running the spectrum from national security to trade. We did it all, and it was a great time.
And you and I were in New Zealand and left there 2 hours, about 2 hours before the huge earthquake. And
right.
we were in the North Island, and we found out about it then. So it's good to have you with us. And
Thanks for the invitation.
Our other guest lecturer is Phil Eskeland. Phil and I worked together for 25 and a half years. You look pretty good after putting up with me for 25 and a half years, Phil.
Yeah.
Phil, prior to coming to my office, worked for Congressman Marlene from Montana. And then prior to that, you were at the White House. Is that correct, Phil?
Yes, but it's not as august as it sounds. I worked in the Office of Correspondence, so I helped respond to President Reagan's mail.
All right, that sounds pretty exciting. And then Phil was in several executive positions in my congressional office for 20 years, and likewise on the Small Business Committee. Phil always has been my chief policy advisor, and when I finished my book, I made sure that Phil proofread it. And then I found out more about myself than I knew after Phil was able to go through it. So, Phil, tell us what you're doing now, and then Nien, I'll ask you that same question, then we can get started.
Well, right now I'm doing a little contract work here and there. So, based on my experience on the Small Business Committee, a law firm hired me to help them deal with understanding the payment protection program that was enacted earlier this spring.
And what's the name of the firm?
Gammon Grange. So they kind of specialize in nonprofits, so particularly religious nonprofits. So this was unusual territory for them because for the first time, a loan program of the Small Business Administration was open to these nonprofits, even for churches, to be used to pay for staff salaries. So,
and
the
Phil
firm
and
is
I together
working through constitutional issues as well, because it's rare that taxpayer money could be used to fund the salaries of ministers, for example.
And then Phil and I were together for 9/11 and also Katrina, and the Small Business Administration had a lead in both of those in terms of recovery for businesses and also for home loans. And so those were two very busy parts of our time. in Washington, helping to actually restart the economy. When 9/11 happened, we had to change a lot of laws in a hurry and regulations. And then Nien, tell us what you're doing now.
Sure. Well, after I left Congress, I went to Walmart, and after a little bit stint there in 2017, I created Artemis ESG, which is a consulting firm focused on helping on environmental, social governance, ESG. I had this great idea. It was it was a little bit silly looking back that I wanted to democratize public affairs and allow companies that aren't super large and individuals who aren't super wealthy to access public affairs tools to get their message across and to be active on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Now I work primarily in the food, agriculture, and biotech industries. I support companies as large as publicly listed conglomerates down to small businesses. I've got some clients in your old neck of the woods outside of Rockford, and so I'm doing the whole gamut. And it's a challenging time right now, but it's certainly an exciting time.
Okay, the topic that we have both of you talking about is Congress and the politics of U.S. foreign policy, and then U.S.-Asia business climate. So go ahead, program is yours, gentlemen.
All right. Well, I guess I'll start again. Thank you for the opportunity. I came out to Rockford University when it was called Rockford College a few times, and I particularly remember one time when we had the European Union ambassador to the United States come and visit Hugo Payman in the late 90s, and he spoke to students and community members, and he was gracious enough to stick around and talk to students after the program was over. But this is just one small illustration of the nexus between foreign policy making and Congress. Because why would an ambassador come out to Rockford at the invitation of Congressman Manzullo? Well, it's because more and more countries and embassies are realizing that Congress plays a significant role in the development of U.S. foreign policy, and many embassies actually have staff dedicated solely to that. But what's the basis for this intersection? Well, I think you have to go back to the understanding of our founding documents, because we transitioned from an Articles of Confederation to the U.S. Constitution, in part because there was a confusion on who controls foreign policy, who speaks for the United States. Because under the Articles of Confederation, there was, a president of Congress, so to speak, but he had basically no staff to carry out any executive responsibility. And you had states were sovereign. They were kind of doing almost their own foreign policy. They had their own trade policy. Customs duties, the main source of revenue for the government at the time, was kind of kept by the states. And they were supposed to pass it along to the federal government, but they rarely did. They were also supposed to contribute forces to a national army, and the state militias stayed within the state. So one of the big reasons we have the Constitution is because of this issue. But they created, obviously, as many of you all know, 3 branches of government, and they're all co-equal. But you have slightly different roles in which the president, the executive branch, carries out policies adopted by Congress. But Congress is the one that actually passes the laws. So, but there was a first crisis in the early part of our country on who's running foreign policy. So we had France declared war on Great Britain, and France wanted us to be allies with them. And President Washington felt that we should be neutral. But who gets the say in that? So there was a debate in Washington's cabinet as to whether or not we should request Congress to actually declare the United States as neutral. But Washington didn't do that, and he just declared that we're neutral. Congress did pass a law the next year saying that, but this is really the first time that the president executed foreign policy without a direct role of Congress. So based on the slide that I gave to students yesterday, I think it's helpful to think of 4 different major areas where Congress and the executive branch share a role, and each one of them is an increasing role for Congress. So, the first area is in war powers, and that's where the president has the most control. The second is in international treaties and agreements. There, the executive branch negotiates the treaties or agreements, and then the Senate passes it by 2/3 vote or rejects it. You have foreign economic policy, that's mainly in the trade area. And then last is in foreign aid and international arms sales. So in the first instance with war powers, we have this tension between the commander-in-chief role for the president and that the Congress has the power to declare war. Well, the problem is that we've engaged in hundreds of military actions over the course of our country's history, but Congress has only declared war 11 times in those 200 plus years. So maybe this would be a trivia question for your students, as long as they promise not to look it up on the internet beforehand. But what was the last country that Congress declared war against? And when was it? So that might be a fun question for them. But in the modern era, we haven't had any declaration of wars. It's transformed into authorizations for wars in some cases. And I guess Congress was getting fed up with all these various military actions, what the president can take, and highlighted with the Vietnam War. And in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolutions that basically says the president can deploy forces for a period of 60 days, but if he doesn't get an authorization or a declaration of war from Congress, he has to withdraw those troops in the next 30 days. So every president, regardless of party since 1973, has kind of disagreed with the War Powers Resolution, and they find ways to either perfunctorily comply with it or just kind of ignore it until it's too unpopular or too much pressure to not comply with it anymore. So I had, and Don and I, we had the experience of dealing with Somalia, with Yugoslavia, the air over Iraq, and then when Nien was around, we dealt with Libya, in which that was a more egregious violation of the War Powers Resolution, because President Obama basically said, I don't need to comply with it, even after the 60-day limit passed, because he said really there were no hostilities in Libya. So that actually resulted in a vote in the House of Representatives rebuking the president for ignoring the War Powers Resolution. But there are 3 other major instances that have happened in this area where the role of Congress played a big part. And this is obviously the Gulf War, the War on Terror after 9/11, and then the Iraq War. So in the Gulf War and the Iraq War, those times before U.S. forces were committed to hostile actions, Congress passed a resolution authorizing the use of force. So I remember this is when I was working for Ron Marlinet, and it was really a difficult time, because it's been the first time since the Vietnam War that we would have authorized a large number of forces to engage in offensive military actions in order to kick Iraq's Saddam Hussein out of his occupation of Kuwait. And everyone was really concerned because we thought we would be getting hundreds, if not thousands, of body bags back, because we thought Saddam Hussein would use chemical or biological weapons and wipe out lots of people, not just among our forces, but among our coalition forces. So, and it was a very sober time too, because and the House took it very seriously. We debated a resolution, and usually in the House, there's like 1 hour of general debate, and that's it. But the first they had 2 hours of general debate, and when that wasn't sufficient, they extended the general debate 3 times for a total of 10 hours of debate. And this is when the Democrats were in control of Congress, or in the House back then. And then the resolution we were debating was authored by the Republican minority leader, Bob Michel, at the time. So I think we've seen that. I think Congress has changed a lot since then. I don't know if you could ever replicate something like that again. And the resolution actually passed both the House and the Senate, and there were actually at that time 86 House Democrats that voted yes. So the next area is international agreements and treaties, and again, there's a role for Congress, but more particularly the Senate in 2/3 vote, but that doesn't mean that the House has no say. So like when the Chemical Weapons Convention passed and was ratified by the Senate in 1997, both the House and the Senate had to act to for the implementing legislation to carry out the treaty that was just passed. So that was attached to a like a year-end omnibus spending bill. But still, just because you see in the Constitution that only the Senate has a role to ratify a treaty doesn't mean that the House is absent. There is a role for the House as well. But the trend is going on now that presidents are sometimes doing more international agreements to try to bypass Congress. So that's why you have some angst whenever you see the Paris Climate Accords being signed and then trying to be carried out and wasn't ratified by the Senate, or the Iran nuclear agreement, and probably Nien can talk about that, because Congress tried to do a little bit something there, and in terms of a review process, that became law. But then when there was efforts to try to either approve or disapprove the agreement, it didn't go anywhere in Congress. The next major area is foreign economic policy, and then this is where actually Congress has the most direct constitutional authority. They have the ones that have the power to levy duties, or what we call tariffs. But since 1934, Congress has kind of delegated this responsibility to the executive branch to negotiate trade agreements. So now that's known as Trade Promotion Authority. So Congress gives the executive branch certain parameters and a certain time frame in order to negotiate trade agreements. And the next TPA is due to expire in July. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next year if Trade Promotion Authority is renewed or not. So I mean, Don and I, we could talk about, we had some interesting battles in passing various trade agreements, whether it was the North American Free Trade Agreement or permanent normal trade relations with China. Well, what I liked about that issue was it was a bipartisan issue at the time, which I was part of staff whipping teams. There was Democrats and Republicans trying to pass that. But now I think the issue is kind of polarized. And then with President Trump using a lot of tariffs to try to force trade concessions on other countries. Congress had some angst about that, and so it'd be interesting to see what happens next year with Trade Promotion Authority if they try to limit the president's ability to just drop tariffs willy-nilly. And the last is, foreign assistance and arms sales. So, every year Congress has to pass an appropriation bill for, the State Department and the Agency for International Development and all. So Congress can play a big role in there in directing those agencies to do this thing or that thing, as I think Nien mentioned one example before. And then in arms sales, Congress has 30 days to disapprove a potential arms sale. Usually that doesn't happen. Usually something gets negotiated and the concerns are mollified. But if you want a case study on this, I wasn't there for this, but obviously the sale of the AWACS surveillance planes to Saudi Arabia by President Reagan in 1981 was a classic example of how Congress tried to exercise its authority on arms sales, where initially that arms sale was disapproved by the House by a 3-1 vote, but then when it got to the Senate, it was more evenly divided and the disapproval motion failed, so the arms sale went through. But this principle also applies to other things too, like civilian nuclear cooperation agreements. There, Congress has a role in approving those or disapproving those. So the Congress in that case has 90 days to disapprove a civilian nuclear cooperation agreement. Just quickly on the last point I would raise is another unique role of the Senate is in its ability to confirm executive branch appointments, senior appointments. And so the Senate is very adept at using that authority to try to enact some changes that it would like to see. It would put a hold on a nominee unless the administration did, A, B, C, or D. And this even applies to ambassadors. So if a particular senator has a complaint about how the administration is dealing with a particular country, the senator could put a hold on the ambassador nomination until that's resolved. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nien.
Thanks, Phil. I think that's a very good overview. One of the interesting things about my experience working on Capitol Hill, and it extends to so much, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's business or trade, whether it's regulations, anything else, Congress really makes its own rules. And as much as it may have, we may see it on paper as being written in a certain way, one thing that our students can keep in mind and almost guarantee is that Congress will find a way to do it on its own. I think that's something that, well, Don, you led a lot of those issues and found very creative ways to get things done, and I think that's a good and sometimes a little bit of a negative. But on U.S. Asia business relations, I think on the top of everyone's mind is the U.S.-China business relationship. When it comes to Congress, a lot of the actions that we're seeing today with regard to tariffs, with regard to national security concerns, with Huawei, TikTok is in the news a lot, WeChat, all of those things started percolating 10, 15, even 20 years ago in Congress. America's relationship with China has undergone a huge transformation. After the passage of permanent normalized trade relations with China, China's entry into the World Trade Organization, what began as a full embrace of China, hoping that through the use of business diplomacy, people-to-people contact, the hope that the Communist Party would relax its control on the people and eventually move towards a more free and liberal system, that by and large is now over. And it is a fascinating case study on just how persuasive the argument that people made on the extremes. So when PNTR passed, when China entered the World Trade Organization, the vast majority of the American business community hoped to enter into China and do business. And for a long time, leaders in China really embraced that. And so American businesses rushed, along with European, Southeast Asian, Australian. The whole world went to China because of the dream of the 1.2 billion person market. That has transformed fundamentally as successive Chinese leaders have failed to implement many of the promises that were first made as China was opening again to the rest of the world. Promises such as protection for intellectual property rights, fundamental respect for human rights, non-interference in foreign countries, protection, respect for international law with regards to Taiwan. All of those issues help coalesce the left and the right, the far left and the far right. Within the political system, the far right viewed China through the lens of a human rights, anti-free trade lens against the communist regime. And there's a lot of basis for why they saw China in those black and white terms. On the far left, they also looked at China through the lens of human rights and through anti-labor practices, sweatshops, etc. And there's a lot of good reasons why they did that as well. Over the years, when I was in Congress, I would consider myself center-right. We constantly hoped and we worked to ensure that China did live up to the standards and the agreements that we had wanted them to. But over time, the voices got louder, and as we saw the inequalities of trade build in the United States, when Donald Trump was elected as president, we really saw the final shift of U.S.-China policy completely putting to bed, ending the whole idea of business diplomacy and adopting a very aggressive nature, an aggressive approach to China. Now, to be fair, Xi Jinping, when he came to power and through an unprecedented purge, not seen since Mao Zedong, has really become president for life in China. And the whole focus of what they call the Chinese dream of creating a future where Chinese for China, it's made it hard for the world's two largest economies to function. And when you look at the neighborhood around China, you have Japan, South Korea, you have Taiwan, you have the Philippines, you have some of the most vibrant economies in the world within a short distance from China. For many years after China entered into the World Trade System, countries around China ran headlong into the market. A lot of businesses. Asian countries did particularly well in China, having a closer proximity, understanding more of the culture perhaps. But something happened that was very interesting. The nationalism, the increase in nationalism several years ago against Japan, against South Korea, helped nations around China realize, oh my goodness, we also have to diversify. And so there is an entire movement in the world away from free trade and more towards a protectionist environment. And that's really where we find ourselves today. And as I started my comments about how Congress finds a way to do its own thing, I think in today's environment, Congress has given up a lot of its oversight authority to the executive branch. When last year, as many of you will recall, the implementation of tariffs on China, that was a pretty significant event for the business community, because regardless of what anyone says, American businesses pay the tariffs. It's the importer that pays it and then perhaps passes along to its customer or eats the cost. I represented a large Korean conglomerate that was responsible for 12,000 jobs in the United States, a very good corporate citizen in the food industry. And we were able to engage in the regulatory process and to try to justify, why we shouldn't have tariffs imposed on the products that they were trying to import. Having seen the arguments from the inside, the basis on national security is a difficult one to make across the board. particularly when we're talking about products that have no clear national security application on the face of it. But I worry in terms of the U.S.-Asia business relationship, how low it is today. The conversation. Obviously, I'm having a technical issue. Can you hear me?
Hear you now.
Perfect. So regard to TikTok, those issues are quite worrisome. For many years, the China have always required the United States when entering their country, situation where 50%, 50%.
We're having a problem hearing you, Nien. It's all chopped up.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, but it sounds as though there's a.
Yeah. I'm having technical issues. I will go get another. I will get another audio. So you go ahead and speak.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Phil, I'm wondering if you could talk about the impact, maybe if it has an impact of the increasing polarization of Congress on Congress's ability to have an influence on the foreign policy making process today.
Yes, I mean, it affects things across the board, in which, if there might be some legitimate oversight that might be needed of the State Department or Department of Defense, and then immediately everyone goes into their political corners. I mean, what I liked when we were when Don and I, were on the Small Business Committee. I mean, we tackled. We didn't care that in one sense that President Bush was in office. If there was some problem, we would do the oversight. And of course, the big example of that was the Black Berets, which the Army was moving to require everyone to wear a black beret. And we discovered that they bypassed American manufacturers to purchase those berets overseas in order to meet a pretty tight timeline. So we got lots of pressure to carry on the oversight, but we was like, well, this is good government what we're doing here, and we're trying to restore, American manufacturing. So it actually resulted in a small factory opening in Southwest Virginia to make these berets instead of being made in China and Romania and other places.
Nien, I'm sorry. Are you back, Nien?
I think I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's
okay, yeah. Right. Go ahead.
My
Phil,
apologies.
What's that?
Just finished. I'm just saying that we practiced oversight regardless. I shouldn't say regardless, but we practice oversight without going necessarily into our political corners. But I think now that's what's happening. Even if the Democrats do have a legitimate issue with something in the Trump administration, like maybe something about how they're running their inspector general's offices, for example. And Trump's firing all these inspector generals. I mean, most Republicans immediately defer to defending Trump, as opposed to like looking at the issue and saying, well, this is probably not a good idea to just be firing all the inspector generals.
Nien, you want to go ahead? You were in the middle of a sentence and
then I died. My audio died.
Right. Go ahead.
So going back to U.S.-China trade relations, U.S.-Asia business, one of the concerns that I have with what's happening on TikTok, look, the back-end national security concerns, they're all legitimate. How do we know that Chinese government, the state-owned enterprises, isn't accessing a ton of user data and leaving us less secure? However, the approach that the U.S. government has taken has kind of, in a sense, normalized the requirement for joint ventures. So in the past, when the United States businesses, European businesses wanted to do market entry into China, the government said, you can't come here by yourself, you need a Chinese partner. We see a lot of problems as a result of that. The joint venture, usually it's 50-50, but what happens is a lot of Chinese businesses, the purpose of the joint venture for China is technology transfer, knowledge transfer, and you see a lot of patent thefts, a lot of copying that results in that. When we require, and some people might say that's, well, it's tit for tat, it's fair, what's fair for them is fair for us. When we require TikTok to partner with an American technology provider, we are essentially saying you need a partner here. Obviously, we're not here to steal, Americans aren't here to steal the technology from TikTok, but that normalizes for the international trading system this requirement of joint ventures. Businesses, we should be allowed as an American company to be wholly owned and operate free as would a Chinese company in China. The U.S.-China business relations is at its lowest point that it's ever been. We're going through a presidential election right now. China never will. And so China has time on its side. With COVID, with the restrictions on travel, what we're seeing is really these national barriers now because of health reasons. It's preventing Americans from being able to do business overseas. And I think this will lead to more of a dislocation, more of a supply chain interruption between our economy and theirs. At the end of the day, I don't know how many businesses will return to the United States from China. Likely to go elsewhere, Vietnam, for example. If you run a business and you're looking at your supply chain, it's really important to diversify, to protect yourself from these interruptions. We'll have to see how the world is the day after the election. But these tensions between the two largest economies, it's not helpful. And business is important, but there's also the national security element, which I won't get into, but there is an important part of maintaining a strong economy, and we can't do it without trade. So many of the students at Rockford, whether it's through agriculture or manufacturing, I think, Don, that's one of the great things that you always champion. Let's sell to whoever wants to buy our goods. Let's have the manufacture.
We had an issue come up on the sale of commercial communications satellites to China. And what had happened was China was launching a U.S. satellite, and there was a failure. The U.S. People conferred with the Chinese on why there was a failure, and inadvertently broke an export law that you can't share this type of information. Congress went berserk, and there was a huge fight on the floor, and I was in the minority on it to stop selling communication satellite, not military satellites. Big difference in technology to the Chinese. And I voted in the minority on that. And unfortunately, the U.S. lost world market share on sale of communication satellites because Congress prohibited the sale of those satellites to China. But that
it did more than that. It put communication satellites on basically the arms export list. So every sale of a commercial communication satellite was treated like we were selling a tank overseas. So even if a manufacturer wanted to launch the satellite from French Guiana, through the European Space Agency, which is a French colony, a NATO ally, it was almost like we were treating the French like they were the enemy. And it had all these restrictions. So then people, all these other countries who wanted communication satellites, they purchased from somebody else, so they didn't have to deal with all of our export control restraints. But then, like 10 years, 15 years later, we were able to finally get it shifted back out of the arms control list to the dual use list. But there's still a prohibition on selling those satellites to China.
Nien, did I interrupt you in your presentation?
No. I mean, that was a perfect time to talk about it. Listen, it's, the relationship now is very frayed. It's going to hurt us from a business perspective. We've got 10 million people unemployed in the United States. We have to rebuild and maintain our commercial edge. We have to innovate. We have to support manufacturing. I just, when it comes to Congress, I hope the next Congress will take a more active role in providing oversight in terms of the tariff. So to wrap it up, U.S.-China business relations, general relations has evolved from one of commercial diplomacy. Let's give China a big bear hug, show it the benefits of capitalism. To be fair, I think something like 650 million people have been lifted out of poverty into the middle class. That's a huge achievement. But now we have a coalescing of the left and the right politically to say China is not a responsible player on an international stage and they're a national security threat. My fear is that we've moved so much to one side in terms of how we treat China that, should it be a Biden-Harris administration, the genie's out of the bottle. We're going to treat China in a very harsh way. And ultimately, what that hurts is you and me, the people out working in the manufacturing, working in agriculture. There's not enough for China to buy to ensure that we have decent employment. And so hopefully we become more competitive and we find a way out of this. But Congress will do what Congress does always. So hopefully, looking into the future, Congress hopefully will be more engaged in oversight on trade. Thanks.
But in the midst of all of this, 1 out of 4 bushels of soybeans harvested in the United States, produced in the United States, goes to China. I mean, this is, so the countries in a sense need each other. And there are still American companies that are manufacturing in China that have gone relatively unscathed in light of what's going on. So it's sometimes it's industry by industry. I remember we had a very interesting case involving a Rockford firm where a Chinese knockoff was stealing their technology. And this was quite interesting. They even stole part of the Rockford firm's website. So, Nien, I don't know if you were with me at that time. I know Phil was. Yeah. So I was on that China, the subcommittee on Asia and Pacific, and I think we asked the ambassador from China or the economic attaché to come into the office. And I showed him what was going on, and I mean, he was just, he couldn't believe it. It was so egregious. So a trial took place in China that was monitored by our State Department and the Department of Commerce. And the Chinese courts actually sided with the American firm. Some say it was just for PR, but how many companies have the opportunity to have a member of Congress who sits on the Asia Subcommittee on International Relations to get involved in the intimacy of a lawsuit like that?
Yeah, not many. And Don, certainly, as we see the new Congress come in and new members, you see less and less of that, to be honest. I mean, you and I and Phil, we worked on issues having to do with gefilte fish with Israel. That was the Rockford, that was wastewater treatment. We've done paper shredding. We've done a lot. I mean, we did a lot. And I think that's one aspect of where Congress can still exert a lot of influence, but that's something because you were very interested in it and you understood for the manufacturing caucus that, and as chairman of small business committee, that these are really important times and important ways to invest your scarce resources, your time.
Well, I also chaired the U.S.-China Inter-Parliamentary Exchange. And I think, right. Phil, you went to China with me at least once on that, and Nien.
Yeah, many times. We went many times.
We were there. In fact, one time our chief of staff, Adam McGarry, got accidentally locked up in jail when he got left on the wall, and and the rest of the staff got on the bus, and Adam did not have his passport with him. But that was an interesting time. But we met with many people in China, and I recall a time that we actually visited some industries. And Nien, I think you were with me at the time because Bernie Sanders was on that trip. We were there in China, and Bernie said, you know, I'm interested in visiting any factory that I want. And the Chinese said, no, we've laid these out for you to visit. But still, it was an opportunity to be able to get in there and try to figure out some things on our own. And we actually made some pretty valuable Chinese contacts. Is that type of activity still going on now in Congress, being so divided? And
I mean, you know, I spent the last year as a registered lobbyist and working in Congress. Not so much. It's not, I mean, of course, every member has have their own interests, right? Some are very interested in healthcare, some are very interested in technology innovation, but that core focus and rolling up your sleeves and getting the word out, that's become less and less. And I think right now, for example, it's not comfortable to be seen meeting with China because someone's gonna, you know, claim that you're cozying up to whatever. But it's less and less, and that's a shame. Yeah, panda hugger, exactly.
Well, that's actually another intersection of Congress and foreign policy is these inter-parliamentary exchanges. They've grown over the years and almost like every country wants to have an inter-parliamentary exchange with us. But members of Congress, their time is limited. But the theory behind it is, particularly if it's a country with a parliamentary system of government, is that sometimes you just need the two legislative bodies to meet and not have their executive branch officials, for lack of a better term, kind of in the same room. And so sometimes the parliamentarians of different countries are able to connect with each other and then solve a problem in a particular area of the country's relationship. In other words, kind of bypass the gatekeepers and go and solve the problem. So I think we did that a couple of times with the U.S. Canada exchange, but this is, I think, what was trying to be the goal of the U.S.-China Inter-Parliamentary Exchange, because many of these people who served in the National People's Congress might eventually wind up on the standing committee in China, and maybe they would be able to be more sympathetic to, say, an American point of view if they've been in meetings with actual American legislators, as opposed to, you know, the State Department person at the embassy in Beijing.
Well, so, we had, when I chaired the Small Business Committee from 2001 to 2007, I was also chairman of the U.S.-Canadian Inter-Parliamentary Exchange.
Yeah.
And the president wanted to have the Canadian snowbirds, and I think there are 2 million of them, have to go to an American consulate office every 60 days.
No, they would have been limited to visit the United States for 30 days.
30 days. So we actually held a hearing,
yep.
And Florida Governor Jeb Bush testified by video.
Yep.
What a disaster this would have on the economies, not only in Florida but in Texas. And at that committee, we had committee hearing. We had a lady who was in charge of the snowbirds. She was the informal person, and we had, when I ran a committee, I usually had all the players at one panel, and most chairmen would have the government people come in on one panel. They would testify, and then the people that were really hurt would testify on the second panel, and none of the people from the first panel were there to listen to them. So we put the two panels together, and we had somebody there from immigration, and we actually resolved the issue during the course of the hearing.
Yeah.
It was amazing. We cut through all that bureaucracy, all that red tape, and Phil, what agency was that?
Well, back then it was the Immigration Service. Now it's called ICE, but
right.
It was before it was merged with Customs. But yeah, but that was because you had that connection with the Canadian exchange. So we were actually trying to convince this Canadian parliamentarian to come down and testify, and he was willing to do so, but then his government says, no, we don't allow members of parliament to testify in other countries' parliaments. It would set a diplomatic faux pas. So he said, okay, I'll send you the next best thing. I'll have the lady that represents the Snowbird Association. She can come down and testify. So that's what happened.
It was interesting because that was a huge foreign policy issue. I mean, it could have been disastrous.
You're seeing this now where, like it's next to impossible to cross the U.S.-Canada border now. So there was a story in the paper the other day about this town in Alaska where they send their kids to school in British Columbia, and they can't go to school because the border is closed because they don't want to spread the coronavirus. So these type of things, if a good inter-parliamentary exchange could be, maybe the member, from Alaska could talk to the member from British Columbia that represents that riding, as they call it up there, and maybe they could work something out and give a little talk to the border people in Canada. So I mean, that's the type of thing that we try to accomplish with the inter-parliamentary exchanges.
Do you have any questions, Ron, from the students?
Phil, could you help us understand, or Nien too, differences between the two parties on their foreign policies, especially looking ahead to the election and the possibility of a new party in power in the White House and possibly a new party in power in the Senate?
Do you have a few hours?
I'll try. Yeah, a few hours. I'll try to take a stab at it, a real broad brush. But you have to understand, I think the three of us here are Republicans, so we're trying to be objective. But basically, I think the Trump administration approach is more solitary and more wants to do things on their own. That's the America first. If others want to join us, that's fine, but we're going to make our own way. Well, I think the Biden administration would go back and work in concert with our allies more. So, I mean, that's just a super short answer.
Yeah. I'll add to this. Republicans traditionally, the Trump foreign policy approach is not your traditional Republican foreign policy approach. Traditionally, strong defense, strong military, business diplomacy, engaging free trade agreements. That's how Republicans have in the past viewed foreign policy, strong support for our allies, special relationship with Britain. That's traditional. The Trump way is not traditional. Democrats, more multilateral, more focus on working with United Nations, peacekeeping, more of a focus on climate and how that impacts others. There's no right or wrong answer in that. That's just how the two parties have differed. You could say some were more interventionalists, willing to commit U.S. troops on the ground, or at least no-fly zones, something to that, and others were more less prone for nation building, etc. Those are getting a little bit more in the weeds, but typically that would be it. I think the Biden administration on day one would probably just apologize and try to get along better with our allies, and that's not a bad thing.
But in the midst of it all, go ahead, Ron.
Nien, I'm wondering, there's a lot of talk these days about a new Cold War between the U.S. and China. Do you see that as a possibility? if so, what does that mean for the trade relationship, and kind of what might we expect? What will this one look like?
I do, actually, I do. I do see that as a possibility. It's not something that has to happen. It's something that shouldn't happen, because there's so much at stake. So the territorial waters around China is quite densely populated. The number one foreign policy issue for China is Taiwan. It's too easy for us to really codify and cement this United States versus China narrative. If we do, and we're pointing at each other and creating, weapon systems, etc., that's a really bad precedent. China is not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did not have a functioning market-driven economy. China does. All of our Apple products pretty much are made in China. and so they have very large technology companies as well. Huawei makes a lot of handsets, 5G equipment. We really can see, if we force countries to choose, nations to choose, we could see ourselves with far less influence. And a lot of that's happening. Where we've gone to our allies in Australia and Great Britain and said, hey, Chinese 5G equipment really is suspicious, it's dangerous, and we've convinced them to make changes. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but if we get to the state where we are involved in a full-blown Cold War, I think it's terrible for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. So, but if we continue with Trump a second term, I think their goal is to decouple the United States and maybe the rest of the free world from China, and break supply chains and have them move elsewhere.
You mean the Chinese goal?
No, that's President Trump's goal, and
Okay.
his main aide there. But if Biden's elected, I think there'll still be trade tensions, but I think what he would do is try to corral our allies to join us in trying to fight China's bad trade practices, but then try to find ways to cooperate with China in terms of climate issues, in terms of dealing with North Korea, perhaps, and a few other things. But still probably maintain a strong military presence in the Pacific region. For example, building up, I don't know if you saw, Don, Palau, the president of Palau came and offered to use, his territory to become like a second Guam almost. So I don't know if you remember when you met the president of Palau that came into your office. So.
Well, it was interesting because we got a knock on the door and said, the president's coming to your office. Well, that's pretty impressive. And the sniff dogs came in and everything. Well, it was the president of Palau. And a really nice guy, and Palau plays a huge role in terms of the strategic part of the world. But in terms of both presidential candidates, it's a matter of style. And at least this is my opinion on it. Trump got NAFTA rewritten. And sure, it's not perfect, but there were a lot of issues in there that had to be rewritten. He successfully renegotiated the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and
Really.
well, the parties are working with what they have, and sometimes if you get two parties that are mutually dissatisfied, that's considered a success in foreign affairs. So I think it's just, on top of everything, you put this virus that is just really destroying personal contacts. You can only do so much by Zoom, and that's working pretty nicely under the circumstances here. But foreign diplomacy was always often based on personal relationships, trust. They get built up between uh, people in different countries that are able to move major chess pieces. But with the virus, we're at that huge disadvantage. So it's a whole new era of foreign affairs. But Nien, I just wanted to, in spite of the unfortunate business climate between U.S. and China, there are still U.S. companies that are seeking Chinese markets for their products, and some are even being successful, which is quite interesting. So, if you have a company that's interested in U.S. company interested in exporting the product to China, but also to other parts of the world, where do you start with that? Phil, maybe you want.
Yeah, Phil would be great. Yeah, the best place would be the Foreign Commercial Service, U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service. They've got offices in districts throughout the United States. They've got market research. They can give you a good primer on regulatory issues. Ultimately, you will want to have a deep analysis of the market and do a cost-benefit analysis. But U.S. Commercial Service, Phil?
Yeah. And then if you need, the next step is wondering how you're going to get paid. So you can get financing through the Export-Import Bank of the United States or through the International Trade Loan Programs of the Small Business Administration. They have networks with banks across the United States that specialize in doing trade finance. And like in terms of the SBA, they give a 90% guarantee on an export loan. So that's pretty good. And that's the two big questions most small business exporters have is where can I find new customers? That's the commercial service. And then how am I going to get paid, or where do I get financing? That's XM or SBA.
Well, the Small Business Development Office in Rockford, and most cities have them, is a good start because they can take and direct a small medium-sized business person on where to go, market research, things of that nature. So the goal would be the small business person would know, first of all, if there's even a market for what he wants to sell. And Rockford exports about $2.5 billion a year. In this is a city of 155,000 people. It's one of the most exporting areas in the country, and huge numbers of small, tiny businessmen, very, very small business people are still exporting around the world, including China.
Yeah.
So it's a very complicated situation. I think that's what we really want to encourage is for people to do that, to let the politicians on top try to figure out the posturing, but at the same time try to sell products overseas. At least that's the way I've always believed in it, and we sat under several administrations with different philosophies as to how to deal with China.
So I have some more questions from students. This might be a question for you, Nien. Would you expect the U.S. to rejoin TPP? Is there anything Congress can do about that trade agreement? Or is it dependent on presidential action?
Wow, what a great question. So TPP was a trade agreement that first began under President George W. Bush. It brought together economies on both sides of the Pacific into a free trade zone that would, in a sense, counter China. When the United States pulled out, TPP nations went ahead and formed their own, they continued on to the agreement. I do think if a new administration comes into power and wants to be a part of that, I do think that would probably be possible. Trade agreements are complicated by nature and a lot of interest groups, but if the language has already essentially been negotiated, the last TPP, I think given where China, the strategic threat that China poses now, I think that might be something that is palatable. Whereas before, a lot of Americans focused on the downsides, the negative impact of globalization. On the flip side, China has started its own process of trade negotiations. and trying to, have its own network of preferred trading partners. It's not the high quality trade negotiations that we prefer, but in the geopolitical world, that's how it works.
And then a question for both of you. We have some students that are, possibly looking to work in Washington after college, and are wondering, maybe based on what were your experiences in terms of how you got into, Phil, you worked in the White House earlier in your career and working on Capitol Hill. What were your experiences on how you got into that world, and what advice would you give to students who are looking to do that now?
Well, I would advise getting involved in some club, whether it's young Republicans or young Democrats, or volunteering for some campaign or for some cause. Like many organizations have chapters, and some of them are on college campuses. That's how I started. I worked for I volunteered on a college campus for a pro-life organization. They had offices in DC. So then when I came here for graduate school, I started working there, again in the lowest possible job at the bottom, in their kind of their mail room. And then they told me about this opening in the correspondence office at the White House. And then at the same time too, I had a short-term internship with a freshman member of Congress, who then went on to become the majority leader of the House, Dick Armey. And so I was able to use the network and the leverage from those two experiences, first to get the entry-level White House job, and then to get a permanent job on Capitol Hill. And I've been there ever since. So the main thing what they can do now is probably volunteer, and also apply for their local congressional office, whether it's the member of the House or a senator's office, and try to be an intern.
And those internships are mostly unpaid, but there are internships for the senators and the members of the House that do not necessarily involve Washington, but in local offices. And those are really good opportunities to, actually, it's a better opportunity to get to know the member of Congress when he or she comes home. Because the local office usually just has a handful of people. And you'd be surprised the number of people who started out as drivers. In fact, didn't Senator Mark Kirk start out as a driver for a member of Congress, I think, when he was in college? And then he ended up being a staff person on the Foreign Affairs Committee. In fact, essentially I was his boss as a member of the committee. And then he ran for Congress himself, won that, and then he became United States Senator. Nien, you worked in the State Department.
Well, can I just say one thing? If people are, and maybe Nien would add on to this, but what's changed in the last 5-7 years is the federal government enacted this program called the Pathways Program. So it has a path for people to get students to get either an internship, or if they've graduated from college, it's a program designed for recent college graduates if they want to work in the federal government. And so there's dozens of jobs that are advertised, usually every couple of weeks, where people can apply for these. And then that's what, you kind of start at the bottom there.
Yeah, everything you guys have said is absolutely correct. My advice would be, if you're interested in a Washington experience, start early, plan ahead. If you're going to the federal, the executive branch, so you're going to an agency, State Department, Interior Department, EPA, almost all of those require some form of security clearance. even if it's a real basic one, and that could take some time. A lot of these executive branch agencies have formalized procedures for applying, submitting your resume, etc. Capitol Hill, I am partial. I've worked both in the executive branch and in legislative branch, but there's nothing like Capitol Hill, and it's very entrepreneurial. The organization is flat. If you find a manager that is willing to mentor you, you could do all sorts of things and have a truly unparalleled experience. But also be aware that the internship programs on Capitol Hill also do rotate on a seasonal basis. So there'll be a group that comes in the spring for 5 weeks or 7 weeks, whatever it is. So, you know, call your office, see which member serves on committees that you care about on the issues, because Congress is divided into committees. And so if you really care about the environment, you want to work for someone on the natural resources or on energy and commerce, you really care about healthcare, research the member you want to work for. And it doesn't always have to be your hometown person. It can be. And there's also committee, if you're, you know, if you're a senior or you've got a master's degree, et cetera, you might consider seeing if committees have any openings for internships. And the Senate side and the House side. And also, it might be worth noting, I mean, I haven't done this, but I think courts also, the Supreme Court, or, you know, there might be some, other than law clerks, there might be some opportunities there. But a lot of the independent agencies, you know, FTC, Federal Trade Commission, you know, Food and Drug Administration, you know, those may have also opportunities.
Well, so do not-for-profits.
Exactly, not-for-profits and lobbying firms as well. Yeah.
Carnegie, the Korea Economic Institute of America.
Associations.
A lot of opportunities there. We had a situation, and Phil, remember in 1993, remember we had the massive floods that took place in northern Illinois. We had an 18-year-old intern volunteer. She ran the flood relief program for the congressional office. She was 18 years old. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, I think she had just started her freshman year in college, and she was coordinating agencies and everything. And we were just blown away at the amount of expertise and how she moved into that area. But 18 years old, working in a congressman's office, she subsequently went on to law school and was quite a successful attorney. But there are so many opportunities out there. With an election year going on, students should consider, of course it's kind of short now, volunteering in a congressional campaign. See, I like to do some volunteer work. And by doing that, especially for somebody who is a contender, a challenger, and not in office, you have the opportunity to work in an office with probably somebody who could end up becoming the next chief of staff for the new member of Congress. And those are tremendous contacts to make. And I think that the greatest joy that I had as a member of Congress was being able to work with so many young people as they would come in and absolutely command a subject. I mean, it was, Phil, Nien, you saw it yourself. So some of these kids right out of college would come in with degrees not necessarily related to the areas. Within 3 or 4 months, they were absolute total experts as they commanded the field. And then they carried that expertise through their time in Congress, and then eventually sometimes into the business world or to the world where they would represent associations.
Nien and Phil, thank you so much for taking time to talk with this class and share your experiences and your expertise.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you guys. We really appreciate it. This is a rare opportunity for students to see literally from the inside as to how these relationships work and all the different laws that are involved in it. And again, Phil, thank you so much. And Nien, thank you so much. We'll see you guys later.
All right. Bye now.
Take care.